Today's video is the second in a series discussing the new changes to our TREC contracts. As stated last week, these changes have been approved, but we do not yet know the date on which the contract will be available or mandatory. However, it is good to review these changes now so we can be prepared. Last week, I talked about the change in paragraph 2, which describes what is included in the property to be conveyed by seller to buyer at closing. This led to a discussion of fixtures that are leased and not owned by the seller. And this leads to the change I will discuss today. Paragraph 4 of the TREC contract will change from the real estate license holder disclosure of representation of a related party to a paragraph on leases affecting the property. Paragraph 4 now provides for disclosing of any leases currently affecting the property, such as residential leases, fixture leases, and natural resource leases. Under paragraph 4, seller discloses the various leases, if any, existing and checks an applicable box or boxes which addresses the respective lease. If the property is currently subject to a residential lease, subparagraph A of paragraph 4 of the contract will be checked, which refers the parties then to an addendum titled Addendum regarding residential leases. The addendum allows the parties to either negotiate for seller to terminate the current residential lease and make the tenant vacate the property so buyer has possession after closing, or it provides for seller to assign and buyer assume the obligations of the lease. If buyer assumes the obligation of the lease, then the addendum goes on to provide that the seller has already either given a copy of the lease to buyer or that seller will provide one within 3 days of the contract. If the lease is delivered after execution of the contract, buyer then has the right to terminate after receipt of the lease. The addendum also essentially acts as an estoppel certificate, meaning the seller certifies that the lease is in full force and effect, tenant is not in default, tenant has not prepaid any rent, tenant is not entitled to any offset against the rent for any reason, there are no pending disputes between tenant and landlord, and there are no side agreements between tenant and landlord. If when the contract is executed, the property is subject to a residential third-party lease, the addendum regarding residential leases will be attached. Now, if any of the fixtures or improvements which are permanently installed and attached and included under the property description are leased and not owned by seller, then subparagraph B of paragraph 4 is checked and the addendum regarding fixture leases is attached. The addendum has a twofold purpose. It serves as a disclosure first, and then allows the buyer and seller to negotiate any assumption and assignment of the fixture leases. Again, if the buyer is assuming a fixture lease, it provides that if the buyer has not received a copy of the lease before execution of the contract, then copies will be provided within 5 days of the effective date, and buyer will have 7 days after receipt to terminate. When buyer assumes a fixture lease under the addendum, the buyer also agrees to sign any documents required by the lessor to effect the assignment. I believe the addendum regarding fixture leases will be more common than the residential lease addendum. Finally, if the seller entered into any natural resource lease affecting the property during his ownership of the property, subparagraph C of paragraph 4 of the contract will be checked. No separate addendum is added to this provision, but it does require seller to provide copies of such natural resource leases to buyer. Either seller provides to the buyer before execution of the contract, or he will have to provide them within 3 days after the effective date of the contract, and if after the contract, then buyer will have the right to terminate after a negotiated number of days. As listing agent, its best practice would be to have the seller provide copies of all residential leases, fixture leases, and natural resource leases to which seller is a party, if any, before marketing the property, so any potential buyer will have copies before negotiating and executing the contract. Another best practice, go to the Texas Realtors website where the red line versions of these contracts are posted and save those on your computer for easy reference. It is nice to be able to easily see what changes were made from the previous versions. Other changes to the contract will be discussed in our next video podcast, and I hope this is helpful. Thank you.